So have you ever noticed how often we talk about power? Like it's this big kind of scary thing. Like they have it and we don't.
It's a pretty common narrative, right? Almost like a go-to story. Good guys versus bad guys, the powerful versus the powerless.
Totally. But what if that's, I don't know, what if we're missing something there? What if it's way more complicated than that?
Well, you're in luck, because that's exactly what we're diving into today.
We're talking about Michel Foucault and, well, his ideas about power are definitely going to make you think.
Now, what makes Foucault so insightful, what makes him worth really digging into, is that he doesn't just offer a different take on power. He kind of gives us a whole new way of even thinking about it.
So not just like, oh, they're the bad guys with all the power.
Not even close. Foucault would probably say that even thinking in those terms, that kind of limits us, He points out that we often fixate on what he calls contract oppression. It's this idea that power works mainly through laws and rules that, hold us back.
Right, so the classic image, like big government telling us what to do.
That's the one. And while, yeah, that's definitely part of it, Foucault's saying it's only a tiny piece of the puzzle. He also talks about war repression, power as this constant struggle.
Like who's winning and who's losing, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But even that, he'd say, it misses something crucial. It's not just about saying no about repression. It's also, and this is key, it's also productive.
Productive? Wait, hold on. I thought we were talking about power, not like making pottery. What does that even mean?
This is where Foucault really flips the script. He's saying power doesn't just restrict us, it shapes us. Our desires, our actions, even what we believe is true.
Whoa, okay, so think about it this way. It's not just about who's in charge. It's about how they got everyone to agree on what in charge even means, right?
Exactly. And that's where truth gets really interesting. Because for Foucault, truth isn't some fixed thing. It's all tied up with power. He means what's considered true, valid, right. It changes depending on who's got the power to define it.
So whoever gets to decide what counts as true, they've got a lot of power. I mean, that makes sense, but wow.
Right. And Foucault uses this phrase, power formations, to talk about how those truths get made. Let me see if I can find the exact quote here. Ah, here it is. He says, "There can be no possible exercise of power without a certain economy of discourses of truth, which operates through and on the basis of this association."
Okay, you need to unpack that one a little bit. So it's like these systems, they're churning out truth all the time. And that's how power actually works on us, right?
Yeah. Think about education, law, even medicine. It's not just force, right? It's about specific ways of talking about things, of understanding the world.
So instead of making you believe something, they convince you it's true. Okay, my mind's kind of blown right now.
Yeah.
But if power isn't just something you have, then
yeah.
What is it? How does it actually work?
Well, another quote to help with that. Foucault says, "Power is never appropriated as a commodity or piece of wealth. It's not a thing you own, but something that it kind of flows, He even calls it a verb, not a noun.
So not a crown a king wears, but something that flows through the whole kingdom.
There you go. Through relationships, institutions, even knowledge itself. Always moving and changing, shaping and being shaped.
Which I guess means that even focusing on, say, the president, that's only a tiny part of the picture.
Totally. Foucault argued that this obsession with, the big guy in charge, the king, the president, it actually stops us from seeing how power works on a day-to-day level. Trying to find the one source of power, it just misses the point.
Because it's happening everywhere, all the time, even when we don't see it.
Okay.
I think I'm starting to get it. But what does that actually look like, in real life?
And that's what's so great about Foucault's ideas.
Yeah.
He wants us to look at our everyday lives, the systems we're a part of, work, family, even our own bodies, as places where power is happening.
It's those subtle things, right? Like unspoken rules we just follow, or the ways we're supposed to act, even how we think about ourselves.
Exactly. And this is where those old ways of thinking, like oppressor versus oppressed, they start to fall apart, because power is way more nuanced than that. It's
right.
Well, it's everywhere.
So if power is this constant thing happening everywhere, does that mean we're all just stuck?
Yeah.
Is there any way to fight back?
That's the big question, right? And like with most things, Foucault, the answer is a little complicated. He'd say that even though power shapes us, even though it's everywhere, we're not powerless. We can resist. We're not robots, thankfully.
Okay, good. So there's hope. Tell me more.
Let's do it. We'll dive into that right after this.
So we're back. And I got to say, my brain is doing some serious processing after that last part. If power is as sneaky and as pervasive as Foucault says, how do we even begin to challenge it? It feels almost impossible.
It's a common reaction. And yeah, Foucault would probably agree that trying to grab power directly, find the source and just shut it down, probably not going to work.
Right, like storming the castle isn't the answer here. So how do we even think about resistance if power is woven into, like, everything?
Okay, so remember how we were talking about power being productive? Like it actually shapes how we see the world, even what we want. Foucault says that's exactly where we need to focus.
Because if we can understand how it's shaping us, maybe we can find some, I don't know, some wiggle room.
You got it. It's not about getting rid of power, which, let's be real, is impossible, but about figuring out how it works on us, how it flows through us, so that maybe we can redirect that flow.
Okay, that's an interesting way to think about it. But how do we actually de-daith? Where do you even begin?
Foucault would say, step 1, pay attention. Become aware of the subtle ways power is working in your daily life. What are those mechanisms? How is it shaping your behavior, your beliefs, even your sense of self?
So not just the big picture stuff, but those little everyday moments where power is kind of doing its thing, like at work, at home, even in our own heads, right?
You got it. And remember those power formations we were talking about? Education, law, all that. Foucault's point is those systems don't just rely on like big pronouncements and control from the top down. They've got these smaller mechanisms, these little pressure points everywhere.
So like instead of just looking at the king, we got to look at the advisors, the scribes, even the guards enforcing the rules.
Exactly. It's even more than that. Think about how those laws and pronouncements, how they get inside people's heads.
Because it's one thing to follow a law because you're afraid of getting in trouble, but it's different if you actually believe it's the right thing to do.
There you go. And that's where things get really interesting. It's not just power being imposed on us. We're participating in it. We're even reproducing it.
Right.
Usually without even realizing it.
Okay, whoa. So it's almost like we're both prisoners of power and also like helping it along.
Yeah, it's a tough pill to swallow. But it's also empowering in a way. If we're part of the problem, that means we can be part of the solution too, right?
Right. But how do we do that? How do we go from like accidentally making the problem worse to, I don't know, to actively resisting?
Well, Foucault never gave us a step-by-step guide, and that's partly because he knew that resistance has to change depending on the situation. What works one time might not work another.
So no magic wand, no one right answer for every single situation.
Nope, afraid not. But what he does give us are tools, new ways to think about resistance that are more nuanced, more strategic.
Like what? Give me an example. I'm ready to use these tools.
Okay, so one major insight from Foucault is that resistance often works best when it's focused on those small mechanisms we were talking about, those little pressure points where power is flowing in our everyday lives.
Can you, like, give me a real-life example? How does that actually look?
Sure. Think about language. Like, the words we use can actually reinforce power dynamics, the way we talk about gender roles, the way we label certain groups of people.
Right. Our words have power, for sure.
They do. And that's just one small example. Think about all those unspoken rules at work, expectations within families, even ideas about what it means to be normal. Those are all places where power is at play.
Wow. The more you start to pay attention, the more you see it, huh? But seeing it is one thing.
Yeah.
Actually doing something about it, that feels really hard.
It takes a lot of courage. But the point is,
Yeah.
even small acts of resistance, when they target those pressure points, they can make a difference. They have this ripple effect.
It's like instead of trying to tear down the whole system,
Yeah.
we can focus on like chipping away at the foundation, brick by brick.
Now, that has a great analogy. It really captures what Foucault is getting at. And the more people start to see these things, the more they question and push back, the weaker that foundation becomes, right?
Okay, yeah. That does make me feel a bit more hopeful. But also, wow, there's so much work to be done.
It's a lifelong journey, but it's worth it. Ultimately, it's about creating a world where power is more balanced, more equal, where everyone has a voice.
Love that. So if we're not just trying to, like, overthrow the system, what does a smarter, more strategic approach to challenging power actually look like? How do we go from simply seeing it to actually doing something about it? So how do we take all these ideas about power and actually make a difference?
Well, Foucault, he wasn't big on giving out, like, step-by-step instructions.
Which I guess makes sense, right? Kind of like how power itself isn't this one-size-fits-all thing.
Exactly. He believed that the best ways to resist, they come from the specific situation, the context, you know?
So it's less about following a rule book and more about, like, developing that awareness so we can see those opportunities when they're right in front of us.
Exactly. Because remember, power itself is always shifting, changing, finding new ways to, do its thing.
So we got to be able to adapt too, ready to like challenge those power dynamics wherever they pop up.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of why Foucault always emphasized critical thinking. Questioning those assumptions, those things everyone just accepts as true, even if maybe they shouldn't.
Because if we can start to see those things for what they really are, like strategies of power, then we can start to, I don't know, develop our own counter strategies,
All right,
right?
now you're getting it. It's about recognizing the game that's being played and then finding ways to change the rules.
So it's not just about fighting against something. It's about creating something new.
Absolutely. Imagine being able to relate to each other, to the world, in ways that aren't so constricted by those, those invisible structures.
Okay, that's exciting. But also a little daunting, honestly. Changing how we understand and interact with power. That's a pretty big task, right?
It is, but that's also why it's so important. And listen, it's not something any one person can do alone. It takes all of us. Listening to each other, learning from our experiences, working together.
So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do, like in their own lives, to start putting these ideas into practice?
Well, how about this? Just start paying attention. Really notice how power is showing up in your everyday life. Listen to the language people use, the rules that work, those subtle ways people try to, sway you, change your mind.
And don't be afraid to, like, ask questions, push back on those assumptions, speak up when something feels off.
Exactly. Every time you do that, you're making a difference, especially when we do it together.
So it's about finding those cracks in the system and prying them open a little bit wider.
I love that. And hey, who knows? Maybe if enough of us do that, we can build something new in those cracks, something more just, more equal.
Now that's a future worth fighting for. And on that note, I'd say we've done some serious deep diving today.
We have. As always, it's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And a huge thank you to all of you for listening in and joining us on this journey. We hope this deep dive has given you some new ways of thinking about power, some tools you can use in your own life. Because, as they say, knowledge is power. And sometimes questioning everything, well, that's the most powerful thing you can do.